Does it make you nervous being a New Orleans parent? Because you're exposing your kid to such strange and unique things.
I mean, I just feel like it's stressful being a parent. Like
I don't know. I would nod, but I have no point of reference.
Your kids just. I mean, the minute you let them out the house, then you have now lost control over what they know and what they don't know. Which is like not bad. I mean, like there's a lot to be learned from the world, but there's a lot to be learned from the world that you wouldn't necessarily want your kids
to expose them to.
You know, picking up.
Do you worry about the internet?
Not yet. I mean, my son came home like maybe a month ago, and I guess at school they had to learn how to like do research. He's in first grade.
Yeah.
And so he wanted us to get him on Google, and he's like, if you just get me to Google, I could take it from here.
Nah, because I know the stuff I was Googling when I was you said first grade?
First. So like luckily right now he's
6, 7?
Yeah, he's 6. His interests are, normal things. So he wants to Google frogs and stuff like that.
But it gets
but you're just like, oh, like he now knows what Google is. He knows that there's this website you could go somewhere and
to just see things.
And if you type something in, it'll tell you the answer to stuff.
Does he do YouTube?
They know what YouTube is, but we don't go down that road. We don't go down that road.
Laura said her first phone was a flip phone. Because I was trying to find the break. Like, where I fit into the thing generationally is that, like, I was in the no internet part of the life. And then we got a landline installed in the house. And then I would yell at my sister because she would always be on the computer.
You're trying to call someone on the phone, yeah.
Like, I would be calling her. I'd be like, I want to go in chat rooms and go see what that's all about, or just Google random shit.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to think. We had a computer when I was in high school. Like my mom, I don't know. So it was like where she worked, they were like getting rid of old like electronics. So she was able to like get a computer, but it didn't have the internet for a long time.
Did you have floppy disks where you
those floppy disks? And I remember playing Oregon Trail in 4th grade. It was like those Oregon Trail and what was the Carmen Sandiego thing called? Like where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? And so I think it was like once. I don't know what the rotation was, but you had to rotate through all the kids, and you got 30 minutes on the computer. And this was like back in like the DOS days, where it was like the black screen with the green
text. You would have to like.
But there was like a couple little programs, and you got 30 minutes. You can either play Carmen Sandiego or Oregon Trail, and that was my, experience with computers at an early age. It was like in school for those 30 minutes, you could do what you wanted to do.
That was me too. The floppy disks.
And then it was only when I got to college that I had like internet in my life on a daily basis.
It was a thing that you would contact. And then smartphones came right then.
Yeah. I didn't get my first, smartphones
you were
came
out
a
of
while.
college with?
Yeah. I didn't get my first phone until I graduated college. I moved to Philly to teach at TFA.
Okay.
And I was like, well, I'm in this big city and I have no phone. And so that's when I got my first flip phone. And then I think I probably graduated to what we would call a smartphone. I don't know.
Like the Gen 1 iPhone?
No. The first iPhone I had was the 6.
What did you do before?
I had like Android phones. Like I was all into Android, but then
it's cool. I just switched to Android. I really dig it.
But their phones are too big.
I did the Pixel, the Google Pixel.
Yeah, they're all too big. And then
fine.
But do you remember it was like iPhone came out with, I think it was like the 6 SE. So it was like in the size of a 5, but it had like had like the inside of a 7. So remember the 5 was like thick and kind of more rectangular.
I had one of those, yeah. It had like a silver bezel around it.
Yeah. So that was the first iPhone I had, and then I don't know, maybe 6 months ago, it just stopped charging, and so I had to get another one.
That's a good run. Now it runs you 18 months and it explodes.
Yeah.
All the stuff falls apart. Are you familiar with how we run this show here, this operation?
I want to say yes because that would mean that I'd be paying. Have listened to it, but I'd be lying.
Yeah. I don't want you to lie.
Okay.
It's good. Very, very few, but very dedicated listeners is kind of where we're at right now.
I mean, you got to start somewhere.
It's the groundswell.
You got to start somewhere.
Yeah, so it's open-ended. Why am I doing this? It starts, it's like, obviously conversational.
Yeah.
With badass people doing super interesting things, kind of exploring who they are, what keeps them driving and motivated.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've had some people We had Charles on recently. That was a lot of fun. Talked about our feelings. Loved it. Talked about psych. Loved it.
Oh, that's right. He has a psych PhD.
Didn't get into dream interpretation, but...
Oh, you know who you need to get on?
Who's that?
Nadia.
She's big into that?
She's like into the astrology and the... So she just taught me that there's a difference between sun signs and moon signs.
I recently learned that, like 6 months ago.
Yeah, so...
Did it say anything about you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Well, then you know it all. Yeah, and we're going to run like 45 minutes, but it's going to go really fast.
Let's do it.
You'll blink and it'll be over. So I guess you should introduce yourself and let us know who you are and what is this whole Ruthless for Good thing.
Who am I? That is a question I'm asking myself all the time. Well, my name is Aaron Walker. Mm-hmm. I founded this thing called Camelback Ventures, which sounds really corporate-y, but it's a nonprofit. And, we're focused on running an accelerator, focus on people of color and women. We've been doing it since I started in 2013 on this project.
Really?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And it's actually my third startup. So, I've seen everything from like work pretty damn well, which I would call Camelback, to like not work at all, to like it's going okay, but yeah.
It's not going anywhere. It's not.
Yeah, it's sort of like putzing along.
What were the initial ones? What did you?
Yeah, so I remember it was 2011. I had this idea for a company I call Teacher Capital Management, which was essentially a teacher talent agency. It was like, how could we give teachers agents like athletes and entertainers do?
There's a Key and Peele skit on that.
Yeah.
Did they steal your ideas?
No. When did the skit come out? I
think after 2011.
After, yeah. So they stole it from me, probably.
Dang. You shouldn't have been so public about it.
And it was just born of this. At the time, I was living in New York, and like basically every year felt like Groundhog's Day, because there would be something in the spring where the union would like sue the district, and like they just sort of like go round and round about some sort of labor issue. And I just thought to myself, like, we're always talking in education about how we should elevate the teaching profession, and we should treat teachers like professionals. And I was like, I understand what collective bargaining is, and I sort of believe in the power of it, but I think the way it's manifested in education and that isn't always helpful for kids is that, when you negotiate for the group, you sort of negotiate to the lowest common denominator. Mm-hmm. And so it would be like, if you're a really great teacher, you would just get what you got in terms of salary and comp because you were a seventh-year teacher, and it didn't
not because you were a spectacular.
Right. It didn't really matter if you were good or bad. I mean, I guess it mattered because you could lose your job, but at some point you have tenure too. So it's like whatever. So I don't know. I think like in life sometimes we operate at poles, and I think oftentimes the right solution is somewhere in the middle. So, on the one hand, you have sort of at-will employment, which is the way most people operate, but and that I think has adverse effects on kids in schools. I think what it does is it forces short-term thinking. If you're a teacher and you're at will, what that essentially means is every day you have to be cognizant of what you need to do to like be asked to come back for the next year.
You staff by budget instead of by sort of a longer horizon. Yeah. Your incentives change for
and
the
even as a teacher, right? Even as a teacher, just thinking, well, what do I need to do to be able to be asked back next year? And that question sometimes isn't the benefit of the student, but oftentimes it doesn't have to be.
Yeah.
So I think you have that pole where it encourages sort of short-term thinking. Let me get the kids to pass the test, like whatever the things are that matter at your particular workplace. And then you have sort of this other poll where, you know, you have the ability to get tenure. Job security is pretty secure if you can get that. You know, like there's no particular motivation to be good or not. And so I can sort of understand the move to sort of go to the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah. But you don't want to burn everything down because you don't know what works and what doesn't work necessarily.
But I actually sort of think that or at least I thought at the time, I haven't thought about this in a while, that the solution is somewhere in the middle. Like, so as opposed to operating on these polls is like, what would it look like to have teachers have agents where, you know, Rob was a great teacher. And so we said, hey, you know, we're going to give you a 3-year deal for $80,000 a year, right? Mm-hmm. Giving you some sort of medium-term security as an employee and as a teacher, but also not necessarily like locking the school into, you know, you having to be there forever. And in that way, you can reward Rob because he is a great teacher, and like there are ways for us to measure those things. Some, you know, very data driven, but others just qualitatively driven as well. And you know, why can't you negotiate for $80,000 for 3 years if I'm like a mediocre teacher? I'm like showing the kids movies in the class. Like, why should you and I make the same?
Wow. So what happened?
So it was really hard. I mean, so I was living in New York, and so you sort of think like, how do you build a business? So you have to have a market first. Yeah. And you can't. So traditional public schools, there's not a market because they're all unionized. So the only way that you can do that is basically to get the teachers to vote to decertify their union. And like, who am I to get 80,000 teachers in New York City to be like, you know what you should do? You should like
abandon the last
this
70
thing.
Years of organization.
Abandon this thing and try this new idea that I have. I just want to see how it works out. Mm-hmm. Or you can sort of go to the charter market and say like,
did you try it in the charter market?
Yeah, so we went to, you know, unnamed schools and said like, hey, we're always talking about, you know, elevating the teaching profession and paying for performance and all these things. Like, this is, you know, you guys should be into this. This is like the rhetoric that we're talking all the time. And it was just so interesting to see that as soon as like the light clicked that this was a form of representation, people are like turned off. They're like,
what?
Because think about it. If you're a principal and you are leading a school that's at will, you have all the control.
So, interesting.
Right. So the minute that you sort of introduce an intermediary into that process, or someone who's going to advocate in their mind for the teacher, it's like, well, why should I choose that option? Like,
because there's so much bargaining power on the employer side.
Right.
That it sounds like, in a sense, it almost isn't even about the quality of the teacher. Because why would I choose, you know, from the buyer perspective, why would I hurt myself in that way? Why would a principal hurt themselves by not wanting 3-year contracts with high performers? Is my counter incentive that it's too expensive, or I'm just trying to buy people who are going to devalue themselves for the sake of job security, and then I'm going to just try to keep them in my ecosystem? Like, what was the thought process you were saying?
I mean, I think for some it was, you know, like the biggest thing is compensation, right? We can sort of talk about all the other ancillary stuff, but the big thing is compensation. And so, I mean, traditional sort of district schools, public charter schools, they still essentially work on a step and ladder system. Mm-hmm. It's just that public charter schools tend to just pay more in that ladder system.
I see.
Right? So the form of compensation isn't necessarily actually any different than what unions are doing. If you were sort of really step back and sort of look at the structure, it's just that what public charter schools could say is, and not even in all districts, right? Because every region is different. Because there are some municipalities where the per pupil is lower for public charters, and so if you're not supplementing that with philanthropy, then your salaries are lower. So like it just is really dependent on the district. So I happened to be in New York at the time. You know, so their salaries were higher, but it was one of those situations where it was like, you're messing up the system. The minute that you sort of create a new system for one teacher, then you got to do it for all the others.
Yeah.
Right? And do I want to be negotiating one-on-one with every single teacher about what their comp is and who? And then there has to be a level of transparency too.
Yeah.
Right. So if you think about, athletics is probably the more transparent than say entertainment, but the stats are published in the newspaper on baseball cards, so you can sort of see who hit more home runs, but think about the level of transparency that has to exist in that kind of system.
What it would ask of teachers, just the kind of mindset shifts.
Right, you'd have to.
You're going to publish all these scores. You're going to have the qualitative and quantitative metrics. Right. You're going to have.
But we were going. So in some ways, I was intrigued because, 10 years ago, there was like a really strong move to sort of do that.
Yeah.
Right. To sort of, I forget the term that they called it back then, but to sort of quantify teacher performance.
Yeah, it was very heavy.
And so in some ways it was like a beautiful. I sort of think of this first startup was like a thought experiment. Like if we're gonna move in that direction anyway, like let's take it to its extreme and sort of see what happens.
Yeah.
So anyway, the big picture was that it's hard to create a business if there's no market.
Well said.
and so that was really the death knell of that business, is that there wasn't really a viable market there. And I think that that's like a and you can sort of imagine how you could try to change policy to sort of create a market.
Yeah.
But that's like a whole other beast.
That's huge.
Right.
How does that lead you to what you're doing today?
Yeah. So in these first 2 rounds of being startup founder, I just met a lot of people who were like me, who were, connected to education or social impact in some way. A lot of them were people of color. Mm-hmm. And we all sort of had similar stories, I started to find out, stories of, folks trying to moonlight an idea who had really great credentials, but seemed to have a hard time getting funding.
Yeah.
And so I just began to realize, man, there's untapped talent who are out there who are clamoring to be a part of the solution. And in many ways, I sort of saw it as a talent, like a talent thing, right? So we can talk a lot about the diversity piece, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But if you just think about education for the last 20 years, a lot of the philosophy has been around talent. Mm-hmm. So one day Cop created Teach for America as a talent solution, for teachers, and you sort of see different iterations of that. You have new leaders for new schools that created a talent solution for principals, and mm-hmm. you've seen different iterations of that across the country. You've seen the Broad Institute sort of create a talent solution for sort of mid-level district talent, and the iterations of that. They did the same thing. Bro did the same thing with the Superintendent's Academy and the different iterations of that. You can sort of keep going on and on. And so it was this recognition that talent is so important at all these different levels, from teacher all the way to superintendent. And I felt like the same was true in sort of the entrepreneurial world, right? But
you're seeing a disconnect too, it seems.
Yeah, that there was this opportunity to really leverage all the talent that we have at play to solve these big problems. And one of the pieces of talent that we were leaving out were Black and brown folks, largely. And in education, it was sort of dismaying to me because, particularly in the urban context, a lot of the kids that we're serving are Black and brown. And so this unspoken message that Black and brown communities are the problem to be solved, but never the solution. And I didn't necessarily believe that.
It's sort of a working on attitude of the organization versus a working with.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and there was a drumbeat for probably starting 5 or 7 years ago. People would say, if reform is being done to communities and not with communities, right? And so I think Camelbacks came along at this fortuitous time where there was more recognition that this couldn't be the way forward, right? That whatever and I know we all have our own definitions of quote unquote ed reform, but that all these sort of innovative ideas, charter schools, ed tech companies, nonprofits with different sort of solutions couldn't just be done to communities. They need to be done with communities. Yeah. And I think there was also recognition that what that meant was not just like asking them what you want to do, but also allowing them to lead and run and build their own organizations in the vision that they had. And, that's what we were trying to do at Camelback, was to say that there are, people out there who have different life experiences, and therefore give them a different perspective on the world, and therefore give them a perspective on what some of these solutions could be. Yeah. And we should explore that, and we should sort of support them in their leadership and see what could happen, right? So, if we were trying to, solve cancer or some other, disease, we wouldn't say, well, I don't think we should look at those doctors over there. Like you would take all the talent that you had and say, like, come, if you want to help us solve this problem, come on. Like, if you have a basic, level of knowledge and desire, like, come on. And so that was part of my argument, was like, hey, like, we are, trying to solve a problem that is solvable. And we've made change in small pockets, but like, I think I'll say for myself, I won't speak for others, which is, I think there's still so much further to go, right? In terms of to leveling the playing field and closing the opportunity gap and all those things. And so, if we've tried the same things, led by the same people for so long, why not try something new, or at least, introduce some new elements into it? And so, that's part of what I've been trying to do over the last 5 years. And
it's a subtle shift in terms of philosophy from a lot of what we hear nowadays when we talk about diversity, accessibility, things like this. But I think it's really the most critical shift is exactly what you hit on. It's this idea that you saw a really clear problem, like you say with doctors. It's not like somebody would be like, no, let's just not look at those doctors. You're like, no, there's a problem. Like, it's our job to get everybody on the boat so we can figure out what the heck we're going to do to solve this issue. That's really powerful, to say that you're not starting with a philosophy of here's the beginning state of the world, and then we must come at odds with each other, and it's a battle, and it's one versus the other. Yeah. You're coming with a philosophy of, the difficulty is in the accessibility, and the difficulty is in the act of translation, and the ability for people to understand each other and to collaborate, which the consequence of doing that well is that you increase accessibility, diversity, the investability of folks who are otherwise being overlooked. It's such a powerful shift. Yeah. I mean, and I appreciate you saying that. Like, I think, sometimes we have the sense that it's a zero-sum game. Like, that if one gains, one necessarily has to lose. And I think there are some spaces where that is more true than not, but I think in the aggregate that doesn't have to be true. And so, how can we just make the pie a little bit bigger? You told me about a funny story. Yeah. There was one day where I came into your office and I was like, Aaron, I love your model. And you're like, oh, I just had a weird Uber ride with a guy. Do you remember that? Maybe. Keep going. The guy asked you what you did, and you told him a little bit about it, and then he went off on some like political tangent about something. Oh yeah. This was a couple of months ago. Yeah, I remember now. So I was in this. What was it, Uber? I left her. I don't know, rideshare service. You were getting around. You have places to go. And I don't know, sometimes you get in the car and you sort of don't feel like chatting, but the person does, so you're trying to be friendly enough. And he asked me what I do, and so I told him I work with entrepreneurs, try to help them build their businesses. And sometimes I think about leading with the diversity piece, but in some ways I think it doesn't matter. They're still people, so why does that have to be the headline? They're entrepreneurs and we help build their companies. Yeah. And so that's what I did. I sort of left it generic, and I think I might have mentioned social impact, and he sort of just
picked up on this and sort of went on this diatribe. He's like, you probably work with people of color, like, like what? He just went on this whole thing. I was like, what about the white guys and so on and so forth. And I was like, oh, this is not the conversation. Not the conversation I want to be having.
The worst $7 trip I've ever taken.
I just want to get home right now. And so I was like, so what? So I don't know. He goes on this thing and I was like, well, yeah. I sort of like half-heartedly just like verbal nodding so he knows I'm listening to him. So like, what ideas do you have? So he starts telling me about these ideas.
That was a good deflect. What ideas do you have?
Like, what ideas do you have? Like, it's like, well, like, so what would you want to start?
Put some skin in the game.
And so I don't know. He tells me about this idea where he wants to like have this like, car company where it's like, hey, I could basically have different drivers and basically do like his own personal version of Uber. I'm like, okay, well, like whatever, that's fine. But look, it was just funny. It was just one of those things where, you just sort of realize that like we all have different perspectives on these things, and like he as a white guy in 2019 was sort of feeling like under attack, and that like there were all these places that were not for him, which was always sort of interesting to think about, right? Because in many ways, I think the reason why I felt it was important to have a space like Camelback was because there were places for people like me. Like I sort of felt like the whole world was created for people like him. And so I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting to sort of just think about why people feel the way that they feel. Like, why did he as a white male in 2018 sort of feel like his identity was under attack? And look, we're sort of seeing the remnants of those kind of feelings in our politics and in our culture.
I think it's that zero-sum fear, right? It's just what you said, it's that folks aren't really, for whatever reason, everybody is so stoked up on the sort of existential angst that is just so freaking tangible and just won't stop. Like everybody is ready for just the A-bombs to drop. Yeah. And it kind of encamps folks it makes it really hard to be generous, it makes it really hard to be gracious. So it's crazy hearing folks speak with this zero-sum attitude.
Well, that was, I want to say this guy's name is David French, but there was he's like a conservative writer. He wrote this article, maybe it was in the National Review or something, and the thesis of his essay was that what we're sort of seeing in our culture right now is essentially what he called like a white culture war between, more well-to-do whites and less well-to-do whites.
Interesting.
And that really people of color were in the middle. And his contention was that, you have sort of progressive, sort of liberal, well-to-do whites who were like pumping up this diversity issue, and in doing so, allowing sort of people of color to sort of have more access to stuff, whatever that stuff might be, at the expense of sort of less economically well-to-do whites, and that they were resentful of that because on the one hand, sort of these sort of more well-to-do whites were sort of looking down on them and their views on like diversity, so on and so forth. But what they felt was still true was that they weren't willing to, that at the end of the day, well-to-do whites still get to win in this game, that they still get to, that they still have this opportunity to elevate ideas of diversity and provide access to all these other people. But
it's kind of cheap signaling,
right? But at the end of the day, like you still don't lose any of your power, right? Like you still get to maintain your power while being able to sort of say like we're inclusive and diverse and
it's a kind of lip service model.
But for them it was like lip service, yes, but also creating mechanisms that still kept a certain class, at the top, quote unquote, sort of kept them at the top, look down at so economically less well-to-do whites in a way that sort of felt demeaning, but at the end of the day didn't, like, they were still powerless.
There's this divergence between like race assumptions and class assumptions.
Right. And so I was like, I had never really thought about it that way before. I was like, like that's an interesting concept to sort of think that, maybe one interpretation of this is that you're just sort of seeing like a class warfare. I mean, obviously, not in the streets.
But it's really more class driven than.
I mean,
class is a more foundational mechanism than race or gender in a way, or it's just something that should be considered.
Well, I mean, I guess the way I interpret it was just like, hey, if I'm in like rural, pick your state, and my life is not easy. It's it's been hard. Maybe the steel jobs in Birmingham have gone or wherever. And I see all these movements towards diversity and in schools and higher education and the workforce, and I see folks who look like me who are in part sort of touting these ideas, that it's really nice for them to sort of talk about diversity and inclusion and all that, but at the end of the day, like, they don't get to lose any of their status.
It doesn't square up with the kind of life you're still living.
Right. It doesn't square up with the life that you're still living. And so, I'm still looking at the world saying like, well, what about me? And I don't know. Like, I think, I think that's like a reasonable feeling sometimes, right? Like, we also say like, well, what about me? Right. Like, we all are self-interested. And so I think in those ways, those questions are human ones,
So how does something like that inform the way that you operate through the accelerator?
Yeah, no.
And Charles hit on it last week. He mentioned some of like the core values that y'all are instilling in the folks that participate with you. Like, what is the philosophy? Because you really, in a way, have to develop a philosophy. That's what you're doing, is you're articulating a way of looking at the world to everyone who happens to participate in Camelback.
Yeah, I mean, look, every year we sort of have the conversation of like, how are we going to define the universe of people that we are trying to work with, and like there's like contentious discussion about, well, what does diverse mean? Is it just around sort of racial identity? Yes, we've sort of checked the box on that. Is it around gender? We say gender, but in some ways I guess we really mean sex, right? I mean, sort of, pulling apart, sex from gender identity. Yes. Does that mean sexual orientation? Maybe. That could be that could be an underrepresented sort of identity in social entrepreneurship. So you could, you have a gay white guy from St. Louis, who applies to Camelback and says like, I'm underrepresented in this space. I want to be a part of this. Does that count? You could look at veterans. You could sort of begin to sort of think all about the permutations, of those,
It really just keeps going in a lot of ways.
Of those identities. And so, I don't know, I think that's one of the sort of tensions in kind of like this umbrella term diversity, right? Like, what does it really mean? And how do you sort of operate in a way that sort of acknowledges all of them, but realizes that, like, you as an organization have to pick the thing that you're working on.
Yeah.
And so I think as much as we recognize and acknowledge that there are other identities that may be underrepresented, that at least right now we can't be everything to everybody, and I don't know if we should be. I don't know if we're prepared to do that. We sort of build an organization to be that to those people, and so we've made the decision that for us, what that means is, around racial identity and around gender identity, and you know, like there are, you know, and this is what we're going to focus on for the time being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you? There's so much in there. It's like, how do you articulate it? And on the other hand, it's like you can't be everything to everyone, and you shouldn't be everything to everyone. Mm-hmm. In a sense, it's really your choice. It's undergirded entirely by the lessons that you guys have to offer. Mm-hmm. Are there particular, focusing within those two domains, are there particular things that you see trend-wise happening where, because you mentioned earlier a lot of what you're doing is kind of helping translate between folks that don't necessarily know how to understand each other. Entrepreneurs of color, women entrepreneurs, talking to sort of the stereotypical venture capitalists who are listening for particular things. And in that space is where Camelback is providing a lot of value. Yeah. Where does the communication break down?
I mean, so many places. I mean, look, at one level, you know, every industry has its vocabulary. And I could sort of see at some level how that pops up. But language is a barrier, right? You know, and so, you know, we think about language like English, Spanish, Portuguese, and what it takes to learn those languages. Mm-hmm. You know, but all these different sectors have their language. I'm sure you guys have your own language and jargon, and if I spend enough time with y'all, I have to like try to figure out what certain acronyms meant and certain kind of, you know, and so a lot of industries have that. And so some of it is that it's just that simple. Like, how do you sort of help someone just sort of understand jargon that's in someone else's language, in someone else's world? One, you know, but two is like we all sort of come with our own set of biases around certain things. And so, you know, how can we help entrepreneurs first sort of understand what those might be? And I think the tension, and we talk about this all the time, is it incumbent upon them to sort of mold and assimilate to, you know, power, or vice versa, and that's just like a constant tension that we talk about with our fellows. And sometimes I wish I had a better answer for them. Like, you know, I sort of feel like in some ways they come to Camelback hoping that and wanting that for Camelback to be a different place and a different space, and I think our space is, but we don't operate in isolation, right? Like, we are trying to sort of give them an interpretive toolkit and language to sort of help them be successful in, you know, in the world. And, you know, sometimes that comes with sacrifices, molding, you know, things that you say into ways that don't necessarily feel natural, which can sort of feel oppressive, you know?
What's an example of that? Like, what's a conversation where you're sitting with somebody and you have to, where you come to loggerheads at that?
Yeah. I mean, it could even be, you know, just like how we frame issues, you know, so, you know, like this idea of sort of framing things from like a deficit, you know, so, you know, you might have sort of social impact startup, and you're sort of talking about the, you know, what you're doing in the world, and you'll describe things from a sense of lack, like all the things that the kids lack. They don't have this, they don't have that. And in some ways the system was set up for you to sort of talk about problem solution, you know, this thing, these people, this community, this thing is a problem. Here, I have the solution. And, you know, for some people that can feel not genuine to how they want to talk about it, how they see the world. It can sort of feel like they have to sort of talk about people who are them, or who look like them, or who they love, or who they care about in a way that is sort of from this deficit mindset. Whereas they want to come at it and they want to sort of talk about it from an asset, you know, mindset, you know. You know, so they might say something or want to say something like, you know, there are, as opposed to, like, for instance, you take New Orleans, what's like the black male unemployment rate? It's like some 50-something%, some 60%. So you can sort of talk about it in that aspect, or you can say there are, or 60% of black men in New Orleans are untapped talent in our city.
Sure.
Like whatever your sort of framing is, and so you can sort of see small tensions in that, and so, like, the way that you frame it can influence how the conversation continues and how it goes on. But you also see it on the flip side in the questions and how funders or investors or those in the sort of financial power position interpret things. So, people's accents, like maybe have a southern accent, or they sound too fill in the blank. They sound too black. They sound too country. And, like, we definitely had people implicitly and explicitly say things. I have people say things to me about entrepreneurs that we've worked with, on those aspects. And so, like, they would probably never say it to their face.
Mm-hmm.
But, those small things are sort of influencing how they think about interacting, with these entrepreneurs. And, there was some research that came out sort of looking at gender and how they were looking at gender and how women, when they're sort of going out raising money, get asked what they call decelerating questions. So it'll be like, they'll say like why isn't the market for your thing bigger? Whereas they might ask men like an accelerating question, like, so I see you're doing it in this market. Can you tell me all the other markets where you think this could work? Right. So even in just like those small frames, right, that people have, and sort of or I'll give them benefit of the doubt, say subconsciously, so how they frame questions for different audiences. If you're not equipped to sort of answer those questions and turn it back around. So if you're a female founder, you're not equipped to sort of take that decelerating question that's sort of meant to make you small, or make what you're doing small, and sort of flip it.
Mm-hmm.
You could imagine how, if they're looking at a set of investments, and women are overwhelmingly being asked certain sort of questions that are sort of decelerating their work, and they're answering it, at face value, and men are not being asked those questions, and then being given a chance to sort of talk about, like,
to elaborate in a totally different way.
How even that kind of thing can end up in really different sort of funding decisions. And so being able to help entrepreneurs recognize those little spaces, where someone on the surface might say, like, well, I'm not racist, or I'm not sexist, like, I treat everybody the same.
Mm-hmm.
And okay, that's fine. But when you look at the evidence, you can sort of see just like little ways, right? So I think some of this is, I sort of gave them the sort of sensational examples about like how people talk and stuff. Like, I tend to think it's like that's not really how it shows up in in people's interactions. It's in sort of these smaller ways.
Is it kind of like a death by 1,000 cuts?
Yeah.
Where people go, well, listen, I treat everybody the same, but they're sort of primed consciously, subconsciously, however, like you say, don't give an attribution, but there's 50 things that they might say or do in really small moments that would decelerate an entrepreneur.
Yeah, and just little things like where you decide to meet someone, right? So
where you decide to meet someone?
Yeah, just so like in the context that you might decide to meet them. So if you are a male entrepreneur, you might decide to go like, hey, like, come to the bar, come to the wherever, like, let's discuss this over a drink, so let's discuss this in like a more collegial setting or an atmosphere, which just gives you a whole different opportunity to build a relationship. So I bring that up to sort of say, like, you could look at someone's calendar and say, hey, 50% of my meeting with prospective entrepreneurs are with women and 50% with men. Like, look, it's equal. But like, what's the context, for those meetings? Are you? I know it can't exactly be the same like every single time, but are you creating opportunities for both say men and women in this particular case, to sort of get to know you in the same way, to sort of build that relationship with you in the same way? Or are you sort of, in small ways, which have big effects, creating spaces where there's an advantage for one group over another?
How do you speak with these angels or these VCs or these high net worth individuals? How do you speak with them in such a way that really educates them of this? Because you're kind of in the middle, right? Yeah. And on one hand, you have the responsibility to the entrepreneur to sort of pre-prepare them for the ecosystem they're going to involve with. On the other hand, you're providing a really important role to funders who, if I imagine they're kind of like your ideal case funder, they're seeking you out and going, listen, I know that I'm like a 78-year-old machinist who grew up in Tuscaloosa. I just like entrepreneurship and I love investing, but I have no idea what it is like to grow up black in America or as a woman in America, or as insert any other sort of like underrepresented role. What do you provide those folks with? How do you do that? How do you sensitize folks in that kind of way? Yeah,
so we are just getting started seriously with that work. So
also no shade to Tuscaloosa. It could be anywhere. It could be New Orleans.
No, that's right. It could be New York City. Let's be real.
And it is. That's the thing.
Right. That's right. So my colleague Elizabeth is sort of leading some new work for us, where we are going to be working explicitly on like the investor side of the table. So these first 5 years has really been about working on the entrepreneur side, and we're not going to stop that work. We're going to continue that work. But I think it's a two-sided equation, and so I had the opportunity to do a training maybe 2 years ago with the Race Equity Institute. And there's a project here called the Campaign for Equity of New Orleans. And so this Race Equity Institute, REI, has been coming to New Orleans once a month for the last 2 years. And I had the opportunity to do their 2-day training the first time they came. And it was powerful for me, even as a person of color, to sort of sit through and walk through the history of how, so we always talk about race being socially constructed, but to sort of walk through the history of how that came to be, and just how explicit it was, where they wanted to figure out a way to to prevent white indentured servants from running away with black slaves, how they sort of very specifically kind of created different penalties for if you ran away with someone who was white versus if you ran away with someone who was black, and you can begin to sort of build a construction
an incentive system
that way of a system of advantages based on race, right? Even to the point where it's hey, we don't want you to run away, but if you run away with a white person, that will be penalized differently than if you run away with the slave, right? Wow. So just being able to sort of see that history, because we sort of just kind of throw out
it out as a catch-all,
right? Socially constructed. We're how did we actually construct it? So all this to say is being able to sort of see that was powerful, but within that training, they sort of have this analogy that I often use, and I give them credit because it's not mine, but talking about the groundwater, so they sort of say, imagine your favorite body of water, and if you were to see and the water is really dirty and the fish were dying in that water, you wouldn't look at the water, you wouldn't look at the fish and be like, man, what's wrong with those fish? Why are they dead? Yeah, you look at it and you say, that water's dirty. we got to do something about that. Let's call the EPA if it still exists. Let's get our neighbors together. Let's start a group. Let's do something to clean this water. Because you wouldn't blame it on the fish. You would just realize that the fish are just swimming in some murky water, and if it's toxic, they're gonna die. But when we talk about issues of equity, when we talk about issues of diversity and inclusion, oftentimes our starting point is the fish. We sort of look and say, well, why aren't more fill in the blank, low income kids going to college? Why are whatever the thing is, and we start trying to create these solutions, to sort of fix the fish. And look, if I'm being honest, there's elements of our work at Camelback in terms of our entrepreneur focused work, which is like a fish solution. It's like saying we know that this sort of system for entrepreneurs is the water is dirty, but we're gonna work with the fish. We're gonna like work with the entrepreneurs, sort of teach them some tools to kind of swim through this murky water better and navigate it in a different way, and with the hope that that enough of them can make it that we could hold them up and be like, look, they made it. Now, what I think makes us different in terms of ethos is that some people will hold them up and say, look, that fish made it, why didn't all the others? I think we sort of understand that in the short term, there's a necessity to, have as many fish, these entrepreneurs that we're working with, be as successful as possible in this sort of murky water. But as opposed to turning around and saying, why didn't the rest of y'all make it? I think our viewpoint is, what can we do to change the water? Yeah. And so I think that's what the work we're beginning to get into now, which is, what does it look like for us to your question, begin to have, more conversations and work with entrepreneurs. I mean, work with funders, whatever that might mean, philanthropic, mission-driven, impact investing, whatever. And so, like, y'all really have the most ability to clean this water. I mean, maybe not any one of you individually, but collectively, y'all have a lot of ability to clean the water. And there may be some things that we need to do at a macro kind of policy level. But there are a lot of things that we can do at sort of like this mezzanine intermediate level that's not like any one person. It's not like changing laws. Yeah. That can make this really different. And so I think we're just beginning that work now and trying to sort of figure out how we do that effectively. And, we'll see how it goes.
Do you have any hunches so far?
Yeah. My hunch, I don't know. I mean, so I think a couple of things. I think like some of it is being able to like build like a shared not identity, but just sort of understand that we're sort of in this together. Yeah. Right. Like, if you are just purely for the profit motive, then you're missing out on great deals. So if that's what you care about, I mean, there was like a cover of, was it Vanity Fair last year that had the 30 or so black women who had raised over $1 million in venture capital. Yeah. So they like ever. Like,
oh, geez, I thought it was like the 30 for the year.
No, for like, I mean, yeah, ever. And it was like, so let's just imagine if that was your portfolio, like, and all you really cared about was a profit motive. Like, you didn't really care, but about like, diversity and inclusivity. Just based on that 30 or so, 6 of those companies have already exited. There'll probably be another 6 more. I don't know. I feel like, 75% of venture capital firms don't return any capital, right? Probably closer to 90%. Maybe there's like 90% that, between 75 and 90% that break even. And then you're really talking about like the top, 5, 10, 15% that are actually returning any capital to investors. So most of them are just spending other people's money. Yeah. Is what they're doing. Right. Someone said to me like a year ago that venture capital was just like the white guy version of philanthropy, because like they just get to, right? Like you get to make like a boatload of money. You get to spend other people's money, and most of the time you never pay them back. I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to think about it. But anyway, all this to say, which is that if that was your portfolio, if these 30 women were your portfolio, as of last year, we would have already had 6 exits, and many of them are still running their companies, and the best is yet to come. And so
the proof is there.
So the proof, the proof is there. So for those people who care about that, I think you make that kind of argument. I think that for those, there are those who, are sort of, believe in this American ideal of, equality under the law, and so like sort of, pulling on that. But I also just think that, there's just like a lot of stuff that we have, that we have just internalized without even thinking about it, right? So I think some of it's just about exposing ourselves to ourselves, so there was this great book I read maybe like 6 months ago. I forget the subtitle, but it's by the sociologist from Mississippi State University. The title's called like White Kids and Privilege or something like, I forget, but she follows like these 10 families in the Midwest for 2 years, and she wants to understand how these parents teach their kids about race. And I remember it was just, and I'm forgetting some of the details, but I was just so fascinated to just like read this book and sort of see how these parents were implicitly and explicitly sort of teaching their kids about race. And certain things began to click in my mind. And so certain things that used to make me mad still make me mad, but I at least understand now why certain things happen. So for instance, I remember those, I hate to bring up our president, but this is like the only example that's coming to my mind, where there was a reporter who had asked him a question about him using the term white nationalist, and and he sort of interrupted and said, "That's such a racist question." And in a time gone by, I would have not really understood why he said that, right? Because like my conception is like, that's not a racist question, particularly coming from a black woman to you as a white man. Like, there's just like no way that her question could be like that she could be racist towards you, let alone her question be racist. But then sort of connecting, an incident like that to this book, where you sort of see how, like these kids when they grow up, anytime something racial is mentioned, where it's implicitly or explicitly implied that you are sort of quote unquote like talking bad about another race, that's racist. And so these kids sort of grow up with this idea that no matter what your race, if you were saying something about some other race, that's racist. And I was like, oh, I don't agree, but at least now I understand why our current president would have the kind of reaction to that he did. And so I bring all that up to not focus on him, but just to say that I think there's also this space of helping us deconstruct things that we learned as kids about a whole lot of things. Yeah. Where I think, I think about some of the things when I was growing up that people said that we would never say now, right? That was, we sort of knew was bad, but like our culture was very different, in terms of, whether you were talking about, kids with special needs, we would use like this particular R word. Like I think it would just like roll off our tongue and things like that. And none of those things, it wasn't good then. It's not good now. But I think that we have, in a lot of ways, just been taught certain things. And if you can be taught something, you can be untaught it. So
that's the move, man. We've gone 52 minutes.
There we go.
How did it feel?
It's just getting started.
You down for 2 more hours?
I don't know. I think my clock is saying I got to pick up my kids from school soon. But
man, I appreciate you coming through.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.